Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the long-awaited part 2 of how to design a Craftworld's army list for competitive play. I've made a number of videos that are essentially audiovisual versions of content that already appears on my blog, and this video goes in that category. There is one of the most popular strategy guides on the blog is the original How to Design a Craftworld's Army List Part 1. I created a Part 2. Normally when I make a video that corresponds to blog content, I ad-lib it. Maybe I look back at those materials as notes to make sure I cover stuff in the same order or don't leave out something obvious. But I've never actually read any of my content before in a video, and this time I'm going to. I had a look back at this strategy guide, and it's very nuanced, and I think that the most efficient way to deliver this content in this format probably is actually to read it to you. I will go off script at times and mention details that occur to me or perhaps details from recent games, but for the most part, I'm going to be on script. So if you have already read my article, this may be not terribly new for you. However, for those of you who consume content primarily while painting or while commuting, it may all be new for you. So hopefully there is an audience for this. Okay. In part 1 of the strategy guide, I encourage players to approach list building by thinking about the sorts of obstacles that they're likely to encounter in competitive play, and then writing rosters that include ways of overcoming each of those obstacles. So a good list needs to have a way to score objectives, a way to deal with multi-wound heavy infantry, a way to deal with hordes, and so on. And if you're interested in that list of qualities that a good Eldar army needs to have, then watch the first video. That's what that's about. This video, part 2, is about how to move beyond thinking of those tools as individual solutions to individual problems, for example, hordes or multi-wound heavy infantry, and consider instead how all of those elements fit together as part of an overall plan. This process begins with a hard look at resource allocation and unit synergy and concludes with a specific plan for how a given list will win games. This is going to include a guide for auditing your competitive lists, how to approach editing, essentially. Before we dive in, let's define some terms. When I say resource allocation, I don't mean how you spend your points when you put your list together. And I don't mean what models you have to choose from when making your roster. Obviously, that's a concern, right? You can't include warp spiders in a list if you don't own any or can't borrow them. I recommend Borrow Hammer. Sometimes it's very useful. No, I'm specifically referring to other finite pre-game and game time resources that are essential for getting the most out of your units. So I'm specifically thinking of Craftworld sub-faction bonuses, command points, how you distribute your command points, stratagems, psychic powers, and auras. An aura is not in and of itself a finite resource in that once you expend it, it's gone, but nevertheless, it can only be in certain places on the field. That one doesn't come up a great deal for Craftworlds because we don't have a whole lot of units with aura powers. Nevertheless, we'll talk about how those resources need to be considered before you play, when you're list building, how they're allocated. As for unit synergies, when I use that term, I mean how well the units in your list harmonize with one another, or how they create discord by competing with one another for the same resources. Here we go. Resource allocation and unit synergy. So perhaps you used the first video to create a balanced army, right? Maybe you watched How to Design a Craftworld's Army List, and you intentionally set out to craft a list that had ways to deal with each of those obstacles, primary and secondary objectives, hordes, and so on. But when it came time to actually run the list, maybe you found yourself coming up short when you, for example, could not both fire and fade your fire dragons into a wave serpent and fire and fade your squad of 3 warwalkers with star cannons out of line of sight turn 1. Many units available to Craftworld's players really are only worth taking for competitive play if they are enhanced with very specific Craftworld bonuses, stratagems, or psychic powers. So this means that a player building a competitive list needs to consider whether adding a particular unit will starve another unit they plan to include of essential resources. And this can lead to some very hard choices. At the time that I wrote the article that this video is based on, or the strategy guide that this video is based on, I had recently seen a post on a website which I will not name, in which a famous 40K player, who I will also not name, argued that Howling Banshees are actually awesome in competitive play. I also don't think this guy is a primary Craftworlds player, to be fair. And his explanation went something like this. He said, look, all you have to do is use the matchless agility stratagem on a squad of 10 Banshees first turn to race across the board, then be prepared for a CP reroll if the charge fails. Then you keep an Autarch Skyrunner with them so they can reroll ones to hit, and you cast Empower on them for +1 to wound, and then you use the Supreme Disdain stratagem to generate extra hits on 6s, and you cast both Doom and Jinx on the target. And if you also have Hunters of Ancient Relics and your enemy is standing on an objective, you watch them get wrecked. I'm paraphrasing here to protect the innocent, but this is more or less what he said. Objectively, this guy is a very good player, no doubt. Better than I am. But it doesn't change the fact that that plan is highly dubious for competitive play. And believe me, I would love for my Banshees to be rock stars. I'm an Ibersil player. They're my favorite aspect warrior. I love them. But sinking that level of resources into a unit of Banshees is rarely going to be efficient, because it means not using those stratagems, command points, and psychic powers to enhance more optimal units. Even if your Banshees do manage to kill a unit of Eradicators or some Cataphrons, there is a 100% chance that your sleek, screamy murder elves will then be easily slaughtered by the opponent the next turn. And it's not that unit trading is bad or that it doesn't sometimes make sense to pour a bunch of resources into super buffing a single squad. But before you do, you need to consider whether you are expending resources in the most optimal way. In casual play, you might build a whole list around trying to make Banshees effective just for the fun of it. I have definitely done exactly that many times. I love them. But be aware that you are handicapping yourself when you do this in competitive play, because probably there's a better way you can use those resources. And frankly, Craftworlds already have a steep enough climb in the competitive 40K meta without additional handicaps. Occasionally, careful list construction with a particular plan in mind really does make a suboptimal unit the best choice for a competitive list. At the time I wrote, again, the article that this video is based on, a mixed Eldari list had just won a major tournament with a roster that included the Avatar of Cain. And if you've seen my Avatar of Cain video, I talk a little bit about that, I think. So the Avatar has been famously uncompetitive pretty much since GW introduced it back in 2nd Ed. But in this very particular list, and as part of this player's very particular plan, it was a great investment. And this is how it worked. So he took the secondary objective, While We Stand, We Fight, which gives 5 victory points for each of the 3 most expensive units that are still alive at the end of the game. And he also included another high-cost monster, a Wraithseer with a D cannon, which was relatively easy to keep alive because it can participate in the battle by providing psychic buffs and firing without having line of sight. So it can stay pretty safe. He also took the custom Craftworld trait Expert Crafters, which made the D cannon and the Wailing Doom, the Avatar's enormous relic murder sword, significantly more effective. And finally, he set aside 9 command points, of which maybe he only had to use 6, every match to sink into the Avatar Resurgent stratagem so that he could just keep resurrecting the incarnation of the bloody-handed god every time it died. Great idea, right? It is. It's a great idea. But it also isn't easy to pull off because you have to consider all of the other adjustments that he needed to make to his list so that it would be viable. First off, he needed units that required virtually no CP investment at all to function at a competitive, optimal level, right? He did this by running minimal squads of Dark Reapers with the Rapid Shot, Exarch Power, and Expert Crafters. If you watch my recent video on Dark Reapers, I talk about this. One of the advantages to that build is that they require no stratagems and no CP to be excellent. And he also ran a bunch of lots of cheap and very self-sufficient Drakari. So again, it's a mixed Eldari list, but nevertheless, the Avatar's in there. So he also, in making this decision, could not include any units in his army that would be more expensive than the 170-point Wraithseer with the D cannon. This means no 5-man units of Shining Spears, no Wraith Blades. No, he had to be very careful about, because he's planning on those secondary objective points. While we stand, we fight. He needed to be very careful to make sure that his most expensive units had high survivability. And he needed to come up with reliable ways to score his other 2 secondary objectives and play the primary objective game without stepping outside the parameters that he set up for himself with those initial choices. So you're not burning a bunch of psychic casts, for example, on some Wraith Blades, which you can't take anyway because of While We Stand, We Fight. You're not burning a bunch of CP on a Celestial Shield for Guardians. It significantly limits the other decisions that you make. So what's the takeaway? It's this. Every time you make a decision to include a particular unit and use a particular combination of Craftworld bonuses or stratagems or psychic powers to enhance that unit, you are altering the relative value of every other model in the Codex. I'll say that one more time. Every time you include a particular unit that makes use of the resources that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, you are altering the relative value of every other model in the Codex. If, for example, you decide you're going to add 5 Wraith Blades and select Hunters of Ancient Relics to enhance your midfield objective control, you've just created an incentive to run additional units of Wraith Blades and Shining Spears to contest objectives, because Hunters of Ancient Relics makes these units significantly more points efficient, right? So once you've committed to that idea for your Wraith Blades, suddenly your Shining Spears are way better. 3 elf units of spears hit nearly as hard as a 5-man unit with those buffs. If you want to know more about how that works, watch the video on Shining Spears if you've not already done so. Nevertheless, you also decrease the viability of including certain other units in the same detachment or army by foreclosing on the possibility of having chosen some other custom Craftworld trait, or because the Wraith Blades and Shining Spears need to monopolize matchless agility and quicken or whatever resources. If you're a newish player and you're listening to this, you might be starting to feel a bit overwhelmed. It's hard enough to learn what your units do and how to play the game, and then worrying about the interrelated consequences of resource allocation might feel absolutely mind-melting at the moment, and if so, don't worry. If you're mostly playing other newish players, you can likely get by without considering these factors right away. But as you improve your knowledge of your units and the game, building lists with these additional concerns in mind will become easier and absolutely essential, especially if you use the guide that I am about to present to help you get started. And for you players who are veterans who do this all the time, in that situation, I think the guide that I'm about to present, maybe it helps you think more intentionally about things that you're doing already, and maybe that gives you some clarity. I hope it does. So, okay, the guide. First principle, 1, begin by prioritizing units essential for the objective game. You win at 40K by scoring points, and you score these points by succeeding at the objective game. So if you are struggling to decide how best to allocate resources, am I going to include this unit or that unit? Both of them need, protect on them to be valuable. And you're trying to decide what unit synergies, therefore, you should emphasize. The best place to start is with units that will enable you to maximize your secondary objective scores and play the primary objectives. So your primary and secondary objective game. That's how you win. So that's concern number 1. And because Craftworld Eldar struggle more than many factions to win the primary objective game, it's even more essential that you maximize your scores for secondary objectives. That said, I recently had an email from a player who said, getting ready for a major tournament, and I'm assuming that I won't be able to hold primary objectives, so my plan is to rely on blasting other people off of them. Blasting other people off of objectives is a solid plan for playing the primary objective game, but not exclusively. You do need to be able to hold at least a couple of objectives, most turns if you're going to have a chance in competitive play. So, nevertheless, because craft worlds are just not as good at holding objectives at a lot of factions, it is therefore, yes, even more important that you max out your secondary objective scores. To be really effective, a unit selected to score a secondary objective should also fill some additional need. In the winning list that I discussed earlier, for example, that Wraithseer was not only worth 5 points at the end of the game for while we stand, we fight, it's also providing psychic support and dangerous ranged attacks with that D cannon that can threaten tanks, heavy infantry that are out of line of sight. If you're interested in Wraithseers, there's a unit-focused video on the Wraithseer. That might be helpful. The Avatar in that list prevented powerful enemy melee units from reaching that fragile backline where, for example, the Wraithseer, although the Wraithseer can hang in melee for sure, but nevertheless, there's all sorts of things you don't necessarily want it exposed to, and the Avatar is a powerful deterrent for fast, aggressive enemy melee units in particular. The Avatar in this list it's a tar pit. It's also a monster killer. So these are units that, yes, they're there to score points. They play a role in the secondary objective game, but they're also ticking boxes on that list of things that a good Craft Worlds list needs to be able to do. If you watched part 1 of this, you should be familiar with those already. All that said, there is a threshold at which it really is okay to include a unit that will do nothing but score points. 5 Warp Spiders with the Web of Deceit Exarch power, which allows them to essentially deep strike a second time, same turn, for example, can be essential to scoring Retrieve Octarius data. It will essentially enable you to pull this off twice, and there's pretty much nothing your opponent can do about that, while also enabling you to pick up 2 or 3 more points for Engage on all fronts. If your teleporting aspect warriors also kill a unit of enemy light infantry holding a backfield objective, even better. But even if they don't do that, they're well worth it. Spiders might not be much of a combat unit, but a single squad can bag you an easy 12 victory points with no CP expenditure and no psychic support. And their presence frees up more combat efficient units to position themselves without having to worry about Engage on all fronts, right? It can be frustrating if you have to choose between targeting what you really want to target with, say a Falcon, versus having to move it elsewhere on the board to make sure you're scoring Engage on all fronts. So begin your list construction by figuring out what secondary objectives you plan to emphasize and exactly how you're going to score them. Include the necessary units, allocate the stratagems and psychic resources you need in order to succeed, and now consider how you will contest primary objectives. Now, keep in mind, I think for secondary objectives, you should have 2 in mind. My 2 most frequently selected in competitive games are Retrieve Octarius data and Engage on all fronts. Craft Worlds are very good at both of those. There are other picks that can be good for other lists. You don't have to have all 3 picked. Oftentimes, you should be at least a little bit flexible, maybe. The target elimination secondaries, no prisoners, assassinate, bring it down. These also, right? They're opponent sensitive. So if an opponent shows up with a certain kind of list, maybe you take no prisoners, or assassinate, and that's not a thing that you have to build into your list. You don't need to make sure you have some assassination power. If your character has enough characters in the list to make assassinate worth it, by turn 4, there should be few enough models left on the table that you can get to those characters. So if Assassinate's a good pick, it's not a pick you had to build around. So nevertheless, the initial choices that you make about how you're going to play secondary objectives and how you're going to play primary objectives, these will create the parameters for the rest of your list as you move forward with selecting units to fill other roles, described in the first video about scoring and elimination. If you haven't already watched the video on how Craft Worlds most effectively can play primary objectives, I would suggest doing that, because there are units, right, that you need to include with that role in mind. So once you have units for primary objectives, you have units for secondary objectives, and you have a plan, you have the spine, the Wraithbone nervous system, I guess, of an effective Craftworlds list. Okay, a tip for newbies. Remember that you can include 2 separate detachments with different Craftworld bonuses. So, for example, you might give both detachments Expert Crafters, but maybe your Vanguard detachment benefits more from Masterful Shots, which lets you ignore cover, while your patrol of melee-oriented objective holders might prefer Hunters of Ancient Relics to get extra attacks when they're near objectives. Splitting detachment bonuses in this way can feel a little janky and not in the spirit of the game for new or narrative players, but it really is absolutely standard in tournament play. You do, and most tournaments will require you to have the detachments easily visually distinguishable from one another. Sometimes on infantry models, maybe that just means painting a band around the base, and then painting maybe a single panel, the band color on certain tanks. Some tournaments might have rules that require you to have more elaborately different paint schemes. Hopefully that's something that you can manage in your collection. But as long as you can satisfy the basic rules for the tournament in terms of detachments being distinguished from one another in this way, it's completely reasonable in competitive play to run a mixed detachment Craftworld list. There it is. Okay. So part 2. So that, yes, part 1 is to prioritize units that are essential for scoring. The second aspect to advanced list design is to identify package deals, and this will streamline list construction hugely. So if you initially approach list building with specific and special attention to resource allocation and unit synergy, it will be time-consuming, mentally demanding, and nevertheless, quickly it will be much easier as you learn to recognize package deals. There are certain groups of units that function especially well together and have predictable resource demands that make them incompatible with other blocks of units in your collection. So a good example of this is the dual Night Spinner build that I suggested in the blog post, How to Use the Backline Farseer, Soccer Mom of Space Elves. It's essentially a couple of Night Spinners with an Autarch and a nearby Farseer who can pop Runes of Witnessing. So the Craftworld's Autarch has to be the same Craftworld, lets them reroll 1s to hit. The Farseer lets them, with that stratagem, reroll 1s to wound. And if they also have Expert Crafters, say they roll all of their reroll all of their 1s to hit and 1-2 to wound. And then and 1-2 to hit, and then all of their 1s to wound and 1-2. It makes those Night Spinners just absolute demons. It also increases the number of 6s you roll, which gives you the -4 AP, and so on. It's a very powerful combo. But a player must dedicate about 3 CP per turn for specific stratagems in order to make this really optimal, and that might preclude including other units hungry for those command points. You should also identify units that are optimal without any buffs from stratagems, auras, or psychic powers. This can be very difficult in a pure Craftworlds list, but there are a handful of examples. Shadow Specters are one. They do very well with no bonuses. And if one of your Craftworld traits, your custom Craftworld traits is Expert Crafters, your potential list of independent operators that don't require support becomes substantially larger. Singleton Warwalkers, squads of 1 or 2 Vipers, small units of Reapers, MSU units of Shining Spears, they become exceptional. They perform extremely well on their own. A word of caution. Although thinking about your collection in terms of unit groupings can be enormously helpful, and it can save you a lot of time in list design, it is important that you don't become so attached to particular ways of grouping your units that you stop considering new and creative combinations. So, for example, if you are running Hunters of Ancient Relics and Expert Crafters, and you've got 3 MSU Shining Spears in that detachment, it just makes sense to have a unit of Wraithblades too, to bully a midfield objective with Ghost Axes and Shields. It's a powerful combo. But if you get so entrenched in your combos that you don't see other opportunities, you might miss out. The dude with the winning tournament avatar list would probably have missed a great opportunity if he had become mentally inflexible about the potential of his bloody-handed elf demon. Most of us had written the avatar off at the time when he pulled off that win. Okay, third big piece of advice. Complete your list and then perform an audit. So once you've assembled a 2,000 point list, you should go back and check to make sure that the following conditions have been met. 1, your list needs to have answers to all of the potential obstacles presented in the part 1 version of this video. So that's one thing. 2, you need to have accounted for the psychic powers and stratagems required by each individual unit in your army in order for them to perform optimally. Check to make sure that there aren't 2 units that require the same resource at the same time. So, for example, if you have 2 units that really want protect or 2 units that really want matchless agility, you need to rethink your build. And check to make sure you have enough CP to fuel the really essential combos long enough for you to secure your victory, right? So you might, and that might affect what sorts of detachments you're able to include. Obviously, there's certain detachments that will cost you CP at the beginning of the game, and how much stuff you put into Deep Strike, and whether or not maybe you want the opportunity. If you have 3 units of Dark Reapers in your list, but you don't have a transport to put them in, and when you come up against a list that has indirect fire, you don't want to be just gambling on whether you have first turn, so then they all have to go into reserve. That's 2 more CP. If you already burned 3 on a Vanguard detachment, now you've spent 5 before the game starts. If you have 1 thing in the webway, now you're at 6. If you have 2 things at the webway, now you're at 8, right? So you need to think about whether or not you have enough CP to pull off key elements of your strategies and tactics before the game begins. This is also a good opportunity to identify any psychic casts that are really pivotal, right? So if, for example, you know you need Protect to go off because you have a 500.9 elf warlock skyrunner conclave that in order to earn its points needs to stay on the board. So it really needs Protect and it really needs Fortune. It needs a 3-up invuln and a 5-up Feel No Pain, and maybe also Conceal, -1 to hit, maybe. Well, in a list like that, you need to have a plan for making sure that you can pull off your psychic powers. So maybe that means your Farseer Skyrunner runs with a Warlock Skyrunner. You pop Seer Council. Your Warlock, you need to lead with the Farseer who has to cast Focus Will on the Warlock to give him an additional +2. So then with Seer Council, your Warlock is casting Protected a +3. If you make the Warlock your Warlord and give him Seer of the Shifting Vector, he then has a free reroll. And so instead of needing to get to a 7, you just need to get to a 4, and you have 2 rolls to do it. Well, now Protect is all but certain. Deny is a possibility, but that +3 will help against Deny. In lists that are really hungry for psychic powers going off, you can look at the custom Craftworld trait that treats 1s as 2s. That trait's a sleeper. It initially doesn't look good to people because, well, on a handful of very particular dice rolls, I get a +1. But if you look at it statistically, you get those +1s on the rolls where your powers could actually fail, right? Because if you rolled at least 1 on one of those, so a power with a warp cast value of 7 with no bonuses, if you roll a 1 on one die, you only succeed if you roll a 6 on the other. Well, if you treat 1s as 2s, now there are 2 variations of a roll on 2d6, one in which you got a 1 on one die and a 5 on the other, and another in which you got a 5 on the first die and a 1 on the second one that would have failed that will now succeed. And then it stacks if you consider having to overcome an opponent's deny roll. Suddenly all of these rolls that would have been 1 short will now succeed. The point is, if you're really relying on certain psychic casts going off, you need to allocate resources on the front end to make sure that they're not going to work 60% of the time. They're going to work at least 85% of the time or 90%, because otherwise the list probably is not reliable enough. Lastly, the last aspect of a list edit is to check for missed opportunities. So maybe you designed a list unwittingly that barely needs CP at all. And if this is the case, you might look at ways you can optimize it with stratagems you haven't considered. Alternatively, maybe there's a particularly powerful stratagem like Fire and Fade, so good, that you've left out. You haven't thought about it at all. You have nothing that needs to make use of that. And although you don't necessarily need to make use of Fire and Fade, it's so good that it's worth at least considering whether you might have a use for it. It is one of the most powerful tools available to our faction, and maybe you want to make a list, a change to your list to include it. Maybe. Okay. Here's the last bit. Getting to the win, planning for 75. High-level competitive games tend to also be high-scoring games, and most tournament formats will reward high-scoring wins more than low-scoring ones. As such, a really ass-kicking list needs to stand a good chance of scoring over 70 points per game. And this is not including those 10 points that you get just for having a painted army. So before you declare your competitive list is ready for the table, assess exactly how you plan to get to 75 points. Maybe your strategy is to control at least 2 objectives for 3 turns after turn 1. Many of the missions enable you to score 10 points by doing that. Some of them you need to have more, potentially. You also need to have a Wraithbone solid strategy for scoring, in that case, at least 40 points, maybe for secondaries. Or maybe you're planning to get 35 for primaries and 40 for secondaries. Whatever your plan is, it needs to be precise and particular, because very few plans survive first contact with the enemy. If you had some ironclad way to get to 85, then you may find yourself at 70. Once you've done this, consider what an opponent might be able to do to foil you and come up with contingencies. Because even though you may not, in many games, you won't pull off exactly what you were going for. If you think ahead about how your opponent can foil you and come up with contingencies, you are much more likely to not be thwarted. And although it isn't possible to create an army optimized to beat every other list it might encounter, you are much more likely to be successful if you've thought carefully about these challenges in advance. Ultimately, if you have good skills and a competitive army, and you come up against another player with those same assets, it will be your ability to recognize your opponent's grand strategy and foil it while preventing her from doing the same to you that will determine the outcome of the game. And at that point, you will be well beyond list building as a primary concern. That's not what this video is about. But I will say that if you've thought about all of this stuff in advance and you have fluency with your list, if you are such a virtuoso with your own scoring tactics for your list that you just don't need to think about it, you are in a much better place to try to work out what your opponent is doing and foil that. If there are any musicians out there, you can't. You have to be able to, if you're going to improvise, you have to know the music well enough to not have to read every note carefully. So there it is. If you follow the steps presented in the first video and in this video, you should be well on your way to having an army that can terrorize competitive tables at your local game store and perhaps even eventually be a contender in very big tournaments. And I will just briefly remind you what the steps are. So after part 1, after we make sure that we can deal with every possible obstacle we might encounter, step 1 is to prioritize as you're selecting to handle those obstacles, is to prioritize units that you rely on for scoring. Number 2 is to identify groups of units in your collection, identify package deals that work well together and which ones don't work well together, and to build a list. And then step 3 is to perform an audit, to go through and make sure that you still have, after you've made changes, you still can deal with every potential obstacle mentioned in part 1 of this video, and that you've accounted for psychic powers and stratagems and the resource demands of each individual unit and how they might come into conflict with one another, and that you've taken a good hard look at psychic casts and made sure that they are sufficiently statistically likely when you really rely on them. I'm not talking about this stuff. It's nice if Executioner goes off, but sometimes you just really need something like Protect in order for your list to be viable. So you need to make sure that those powers are reliable enough. And lastly, you check for missed opportunities. Did I leave out, say, a stratagem that's particularly powerful, a psychic power that's it's criminal to not take, except in the most bizarre circumstances? Doom, for example. I do occasionally run a list without Doom, but it's so good, you better have a really good reason for leaving it out. And then finally, check to make sure you've got a plan for how you're going to get to 75 points. And in order to tick each of these boxes, you're probably going to have to go back and tinker with the list many times. Here's a final piece of advice. You might be tempted to circumvent the whole process. You listened to this video and you thought, wow, Brent, that sounds hard. You might be tempted to circumvent the whole process of list building by just looking up whatever Craftworld's list did the best at the most recent big tournament or mixed Eldari list and just duplicate that list. I strongly urge you not to do this. Not only does net listing deprive you of one of the most enjoyable aspects of competitive 40K, which is the list building, but also that net listing approach is unlikely to get you the results that you want. Because if you're not the one that went through the mental exercise of thinking about all the questions that I presented in the first video and in this video in order to make the list, you are unlikely to grasp exactly how best to play it. And this is powerfully illustrated in just about every single major 40K tournament when inevitably multiple clones of the last big tournament winning list show up, and those clones never turn out to be the winner. There's probably a counterexample out there, but pretty much never turn out to be the winner. Players copying a list they found online a month ago will almost never play that list as well as the player who designed it. And I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't look at net lists or that you shouldn't look especially carefully at lists that do well. I certainly do. All I'm saying is that if you learn how top competitive players develop effective rosters and mimic the process instead of mimicking the final product, you'll probably get more out of the hobby and end up with better competitive results in the long run. So that's it. Best of luck. I hope your tactical machinations help to restore the glory of the lost Eldari Empire. And that's what I've got. That's part 2. If you found this video useful and you want to be notified when similar videos appear, you might consider subscribing if you've not already done so. If you liked this video, I hope you will click like. And if you have your own ideas about advanced list construction or ideas for new content or questions, please leave a comment in the space below. I always enjoy hearing from you guys. Thanks. That's it.